the cosmos stirs. There's a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation as if a distant memory of falling from a great height. We know we are approaching the grandest of this fate. The size and age of the cosmos are beyond ordinary human understanding, lost somewhere between immensity and eternity is our tiny planetary home, the Earth. For the first time, we have the power to decide the fate of our planet and ourselves. This is a time of great danger, but our species is young and curious and brave. It shows much promise. In the last few millennia, we have made the most astonishing and unexpected discoveries about the cosmos and our place within it. I believe our future depends powerfully on how well we understand this cosmos in which we float like a mote of dust in the morning sky. We're about to begin a journey through the cosmos. We'll encounter galaxies and suns and planets, life and consciousness, coming into being, evolving, and perishing. Worlds of ice and stars of diamond, atoms as massive as suns, and universes smaller than atoms. But it's also a story of our own planet, and the plants and animals that share it with us. And it's a story about us, how we achieved our present understanding of the cosmos, how the cosmos has shaped our evolution and our culture, and what our fate may be. We wish to pursue the truth no matter where it leads. But to find the truth, we need imagination and skepticism both. We will not be afraid to speculate, but we will be careful to distinguish speculation from fact. The cosmos is full beyond measure of elegant truths, of exquisite interrelationships, of the awesome machinery of nature. The surface of the Earth is the shore of the cosmic ocean. On this shore, we've learned most of what we know. Recently, we've waded a little way up, maybe ankle deep, and the water seems inviting. Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. The journey for each of us begins here. We're going to explore the cosmos in a ship of the imagination, unfettered by ordinary limits on speed and size, drawn by the music of cosmic harmonies. It can take us anywhere in space and time. Perfect as a snowflake, organic as a dandelion seed, it will carry us to worlds of dreams and worlds of facts. Come with me. Before us is the cosmos on the grandest scale we know. We are far from the shores of Earth, in the uncharted reaches of the cosmic ocean. Strewn like sea froth on the waves of space are innumerable faint tendrils of light, some of them containing hundreds of billions of suns. These are the galaxies, drifting endlessly in the great cosmic dark. In our ship of the imagination, we are halfway to the edge of the known universe. In this, the first of our cosmic voyages, we begin to explore the universe revealed by science. Through eventually carry us to a far-off and exotic world. But from the depths of space, we cannot detect even the cluster of galaxies in which our Milky Way is embedded, much less the Sun or the Earth. Apply everywhere, throughout the cosmos. But we have just begun to understand these laws. The universe is rich in mystery. Near the center of a cluster of galaxies, there's sometimes a rogue elliptical galaxy made of 1 trillion suns, which devours its neighbors. Perhaps this cyclone of stars is what astronomers on Earth call a quasar. Ordinary measures of distance fail us here in the realm of the galaxies. We need a much larger unit, the light year. It measures how far light travels in a year, nearly 10 trillion kilometers. It measures not time, but enormous distances. Cluster, the individual galaxies are about 300,000 light years apart. So light takes about 300,000 years to go from one galaxy to another. Like stars and planets and people, galaxies are born, live, and die. They may all experience a tumultuous adolescence. During their first 100 million years, their cores may explode. Seen in radio light, great jets of energy pour out and echo across the cosmos. Worlds near the core or along the jets would be incinerated. I wonder how many planets and how many civilizations might be destroyed. Pegasus cluster, there's a ring galaxy, the wreckage left from the collision of two galaxies, a splash in the cosmic pond. Individual galaxies may explode and collide, and their constituent stars may blow up as well. In this supernova explosion, a single star outshines the rest of its galaxy. We are approaching what astronomers on Earth call the local group. 3 million light years across, it contains some 20 galaxies. It's a sparse and rather typical chain of islands in the immense cosmic ocean. We are now only 2 million light years from home. On the maps of space, this galaxy is called M31, the Great Galaxy in Andromeda. It's a vast storm of stars and gas and dust. As we pass over it, we see one of its small satellite galaxies. Clusters of galaxies and the stars of individual galaxies are all held together by gravity. Surrounding M31 are hundreds of globular star clusters. We're approaching one of them. Each cluster orbits the massive center of the galaxy. Some contain up to 1 million separate stars. Every globular cluster is like a swarm of bees bound by gravity, every bee a sun. From the Pegasus cluster, our voyage has taken us 200 million light years to the local group, dominated by two great spiral galaxies. Beyond M31 is another very similar galaxy, its spiral arms slowly turning once every 250 million years. This is our own Milky Way, seen from the outside. This in the obscure backwaters of the Carina Cygnus spiral arm, we humans have evolved to consciousness and some measure of understanding. Concentrated in its brilliant core and strewn along its spiral arms are 400 billion suns. It takes light 100,000 years to travel from one end of the galaxy to the other. Within this galaxy are stars, worlds, and, it may be, an enormous diversity of living things and intelligent beings and spacefaring civilizations. Scattered among the stars of the Milky Way are supernova remnants, each one the remains of a colossal stellar explosion. These filaments of glowing gas are the outer layers of a star which has recently destroyed itself. The gas is unraveling, returning star stuff back into space. And at its heart are the remains of the original star, a dense, shrunken stellar fragment called a pulsar, a natural lighthouse, blinking and hissing, a sun that spins twice each second. Pulsars keep such perfect time that the first one discovered was thought to be a sign of extraterrestrial intelligence, perhaps a navigational beacon for great ships that travel across the light years and between the stars. There may be such intelligences and such starships, but pulsars are not their signature. Instead, they are the doleful reminders that nothing lasts forever, that stars also die. We continue to plummet, falling thousands of light years towards the plane of the galaxy. This is the Milky Way, our galaxy seen edge-on, billions of nuclear furnaces converting matter into starlight. Some stars are flimsy as a soap bubble. Others are 100 trillion times denser than lead. The hottest stars are destined to die young, but red giants are mostly elderly. Such stars are unlikely to have inhabited planets. But yellow dwarf stars, like the sun, are middle-aged, and they are far more common. These stars may have planetary systems, and on such planets, for the first time in our cosmic voyage, we encounter rare forms of matter: ice and rock, air and liquid water. Close to this yellow star is a small, warm, cloudy world with continents and oceans. These conditions permit an even more precious form of matter to arise, life. But this is not the Earth. Intelligent beings have evolved and reworked this planetary surface in a massive engineering enterprise. In the Milky Way galaxy, there may be many worlds on which matter has grown to consciousness. I wonder, are they very different from us? What do they look like? What are their politics, technology, music, religion? Or do they have patterns of culture we can't begin to imagine? Are they also a danger to themselves? Among the many glowing clouds of interstellar gas is one called the Orion Nebula, only 1,500 light years from Earth. These three bright stars are seen by Earthlings as the belt in the familiar constellation of Orion the Hunter. The nebula appears from Earth as a patch of light, the middle star in Orion's sword. It is not a star. It is another thing entirely. A cloud that veils one of nature's secret places. This is a stellar nursery, a place where stars are born. They condense by gravity from gas and dust until their temperatures become so high that they begin to shine. Such clouds mark the births of stars, as others bear witness to their deaths. And after stars condense in the hidden interiors of interstellar clouds, what happens to them? The Pleiades are a loose cluster of young stars only 50 million years old. These fledgling stars are just being let out into the galaxy, still surrounded by wisps of nebulosity, the gas and dust from which they formed. There are clouds that hang like ink blots between the stars. They are made of fine rocky dust, organic matter, and ice. Inside, a few stars begin to turn on. Nearby worlds of ice evaporate and form long comet-like tails, driven back by the stellar winds. Clouds, light years across, drift between the stars. They're filled with organic molecules. The building blocks of life are everywhere. They're easily made. On how many worlds have such complex molecules assembled themselves into patterns we would call alive? Most stars belong to systems of 2 or 3 or many suns bound together by gravity. Each system is isolated from its neighbors by the light years. We are approaching a single ordinary yellow dwarf star, surrounded by a system of 9 planets, dozens of moons, thousands of asteroids, and billions of comets, the family of the Sun. Only 4 light hours from Earth is the planet Neptune, and its giant satellite, Triton. Even in the outskirts of our own solar system, we humans have barely begun our explorations. Only a century ago, we were ignorant even of the existence of the planet Pluto. Its moon, Charon, remained undiscovered until 1978. The rings of Uranus were first detected in 1977. There are new worlds to chart even this close to home. Saturn is a giant gas world. If it has a solid surface, it must lie far below the clouds we see. Saturn's majestic rings are made of trillions of orbiting snowballs. We are now only 80 light minutes from home, a mere 1.5 billion kilometers. The largest planet in our solar system is Jupiter. On its dark side, superbolts of lightning illuminate the clouds, as first revealed by the Voyager spacecraft in 1979. Inside the orbit of Jupiter are countless shattered and broken worldlets, the asteroids. These reefs and shoals mark the border of the realm of giant planets. We are now entering the shallows of the solar system. Here there are worlds with thin atmospheres and solid surfaces, Earth-like planets with landscapes crying out for careful exploration. This world is Mars. In 1976, after a year's voyage, 2 robot explorers from Earth landed on this alien shore. On Mars, there is a volcano as wide as Arizona and almost 3 times the height of Mount Everest. We've named it Mount Olympus. This is a world of wonders. Mars is a planet with ancient river valleys and violent sandstorms driven by winds at half the speed of sound. There is a giant rift in its surface, 5,000 kilometers long. It's called Valles Marineris, the Valley of the Mariner spacecraft that came to explore Mars from a nearby world. In this, our first cosmic voyage, we have just begun the reconnaissance of Mars and all those other planets and stars and galaxies. In voyages to come, we will explore them more fully. But now, we travel the few remaining light minutes to a blue and cloudy world, third from the sun. The end of our long journey is the world where we began. Our travels allow us to see the Earth anew, as if we came from somewhere else. There are
100 billion galaxies and 1 billion trillion stars. Why should this modest planet be the only inhabited world? To me, it seems far more likely that the cosmos is brimming over with life and intelligence. But so far, every living thing, every conscious being, every civilization we know anything about lived there, on Earth. Beneath these clouds, the drama of the human species has been unfolding. We have, at last, come home.
Welcome to the planet Earth, a place with blue nitrogen skies, oceans of liquid water, cool forests, soft meadows, a world positively rippling with life. In the cosmic perspective, it is, for the moment, unique. The only world in which we know with certainty that the matter of the cosmos has become alive and aware. There must be many such worlds scattered through space, but our search for them begins here, with the accumulated wisdom of the men and women of our species, acquired at great cost over 1 million years.
Seemed immense when it was the only world we could explore. Its true size was first worked out in a simple and ingenious way by a man who lived here in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. This tower may have been a communications tower, part of a network running along the North African coast, by which signal bonfires were used to communicate messages of state. It also may have been used as a lighthouse, a navigational beacon for sailing ships out there in the Mediterranean Sea. It is about 50 kilometers west of what was once one of the great cities of the world, Alexandria. In Alexandria, at that time, there lived a man named Eratosthenes. One of his envious contemporaries called him Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, because he said Eratosthenes was second best in the world in everything. But it seems clear that in many fields, Eratosthenes was alpha. He was an astronomer, historian, geographer, philosopher, poet, theater critic, and mathematician. He was also the chief librarian of the great library of Alexandria. And one day, while reading a papyrus book in the library, he came upon a curious account. Far to the south, he read, at the frontier outpost of Sagan, something notable could be seen on the longest day of the year. On June 21st, the shadows of a temple column or a vertical stick would grow shorter as noon approached. And as the hours crept towards midday, the sun's rays would slither down the sides of a deep well, which on other days would remain in shadow. And then, precisely at noon, columns would cast no shadows, and the sun would shine directly down into the water of the well. At that moment, the
the sun was exactly overhead.
It was an observation that someone else might easily have ignored. Sticks, shadows, reflections in wells, the position of the sun, simple, everyday matters of what possible importance might they be. But Eratosthenes was a scientist, and his contemplation of these homely matters changed the world. In a way, made the world. Because Eratosthenes had the presence of mind to experiment, to actually ask whether, back here, near Alexandria, a stick cast a shadow near noon on June the 21st. And it turns out, sticks do. An overly skeptical person might have said that the report from Sagan was in error, but it's an absolutely straightforward observation. Why would anyone lie on such a trivial matter? Eratosthenes asked himself how it could be that at the same moment, a stick in Sagan would cast no shadow, and a stick in Alexandria, 800 kilometers to the north, would cast a very definite shadow. Here's a map of ancient Egypt. I've inserted two sticks, or obelisks, one up here in Alexandria, and one down here in Sagan. Now, if at a certain moment, each stick casts no shadow at all, that's perfectly easy to understand, provided the Earth is flat. If the shadow at Sagan is at a certain length, and the shadow at Alexandria is the same length, that also makes sense on a flat Earth. But how could it be, Eratosthenes asked, that at the same instant there was no shadow at Sagan and a very substantial shadow at Alexandria? The only answer was that the surface of the Earth is curved. Not only that, but the greater the curvature, the bigger the difference in the lengths of the shadows. The sun is so far away that its rays are parallel when they reach the Earth. Sticks at different angles to the sun's rays will cast shadows at different lengths. But the observed difference in the shadow lengths, the distance between Alexandria and Sagan had to be about 7 degrees along the surface of the Earth. By that I mean, if you would imagine these sticks extending all the way down to the center of the Earth, they would there intersect at an angle of about 7 degrees. Well, 7 degrees is something like a 50th of the full circumference of the Earth, 360 degrees. Eratosthenes knew the distance between Alexandria and Sagan. He knew it was 800 kilometers. Why? Because he hired a man to pace out the entire distance so that he could perform the calculation I'm talking about. Now, 800 kilometers times 50 is 40,000 kilometers. So that must be the circumference of the Earth. That's how far it is to go once around the Earth. That's the right answer. Eratosthenes' only tools were sticks, eyes, feet, and brains, plus a zest for experiment. With those tools, he correctly deduced the circumference of the Earth to high precision, with an error of only a few percent. That's pretty good figuring for 2,200 years ago.
Then, as now, the Mediterranean was teeming with ships, merchantmen, fishing vessels, naval flotillas, but there were also courageous voyages into the unknown.
400 years before Eratosthenes, Africa was circumnavigated by a Phoenician fleet in the employ of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. They set sail, probably in boats as frail and open as these, out from the Red Sea, down the east coast of Africa, up into the Atlantic, and then back through the Mediterranean. That epic journey took 3 years, about as long as it takes Voyager to journey from Earth to Saturn. After Eratosthenes, some may have attempted to circumnavigate the Earth, but until the time of Magellan, no one succeeded. What tales of adventure and daring must earlier have been told as sailors and navigators, practical men of the world, gambled their lives on the mathematics of a scientist from ancient Alexandria.
Today, Alexandria shows few traces of its ancient glory, of the days when Eratosthenes walked its broad avenues. Over the centuries, waves of conquerors converted its palaces and temples into castles and churches, then into minarets and mosques. The city was chosen to be the capital of his empire by Alexander the Great on a winter's afternoon in 331 BC. A century later, it had become the greatest city of the world. Each successive civilization has left its mark. But what now remains of the marble city of Alexander's dream? Alexandria is still a thriving marketplace, still a crossroads for the peoples of the Near East. But once it was radiant with self-confidence, certain of its power. Can you recapture a vanished epoch from a few broken statues and scraps of ancient manuscripts?
In Alexandria, there was an immense library and an associated research institute, and in them worked the finest minds in the ancient world. Legendary library, all that survives is this dank and forgotten cellar. It's in the library annex, the Serapeum, which was once a temple, but was later reconsecrated to knowledge. These few moldering shelves, probably once in a basement storage room, are its only physical remains. But this place was once the brain and glory of the greatest city on the planet Earth.
If I could travel back into time, this is the place I would visit. The Library of Alexandria at its height 2,000 years ago. Here, in an important sense, began the intellectual adventure which has led us into space. All the knowledge in the ancient world was once within these marble walls. In the Great Hall, there may have been a mural of Alexander with the crook and flail and ceremonial headdress of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. This library was a citadel of human consciousness, a beacon on our journey to the stars. It was the first true research institute in the history of the world. And what did they study? They studied everything, the entire cosmos. Cosmos is a Greek word for the order of the universe. In a way, it's the opposite of chaos. It implies a deep interconnectedness of all things, the intricate and subtle way that the universe is put together. Genius flourished here. In addition to Eratosthenes, there was the astronomer Hipparchus, who mapped the constellations and established the brightness of the stars. And there was Euclid, who brilliantly systematized geometry, who told his king, who was struggling with some difficult problem in mathematics, that there was no royal road to geometry. There was Dionysius of Thrace, the man who defined the parts of speech, nouns, verbs, so on, who did for language, in a way, what Euclid did for geometry. There was Herophilus, a physiologist who identified the brain rather than the heart as the seat of intelligence. There was Archimedes, the greatest mechanical genius until the time of Leonardo da Vinci. And there was the astronomer Ptolemy, who compiled much of what today is the pseudoscience of astrology. His Earth-centered universe held sway for 1,500 years, showing that intellectual brilliance is no guarantee against being dead wrong. And among these great men, there was also a great woman. Her name was Hypatia. She was a mathematician and an astronomer, the last light of the library, whose martyrdom is bound up with the destruction of this place 7 centuries after it was founded. Look at this place. The Greek kings of Egypt, who succeeded Alexander, regarded advances in science, literature, and medicine as among the treasures of the empire. For centuries, they generously supported research and scholarship, an enlightenment shared by few heads of state then or now. Off this great hall were 10 large research laboratories. There were fountains and colonnades, botanical gardens, and even a zoo with animals from India and sub-Saharan Africa. There were dissecting rooms and an astronomical observatory. But the treasure of the library, consecrated to the god Serapis, built in the city of Alexander, was its collection of books. The organizers of the library combed all the cultures and languages of the world for books. They sent agents abroad to buy up libraries. Commercial ships docking in Alexandria harbor were searched by the police, not for contraband, but for books. The scrolls were borrowed, copied, and returned to their owners. Until studied, these scrolls were collected in great stacks called books from the ships. Accurate numbers are difficult to come by, but it seems that the library contained at its peak nearly 1 million scrolls. The papyrus reed grows in Egypt. It's the origin of our word for paper. And each of those 1 million volumes which once existed in this library were handwritten on papyrus manuscript scrolls. What happened to all those books? Well, the classical civilization that created them disintegrated. The library itself was destroyed. Only a small fraction of the works survived. And as for the rest, we are left only with pathetic, scattered fragments. But how tantalizing those remaining bits and pieces are. For example, we know that there once existed here a book by the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, who apparently argued that the Earth was one of the planets, that like the other planets, it orbits the sun, and that the stars are enormously far away. All absolutely correct. But we had to wait nearly 2,000 years for these facts to be rediscovered. The astronomy stacks of the Alexandria Library. Hipparchus, Ptolemaeus, here we are. Aristarchus. this is the book. How I'd love to be able to read this book. To know how Aristarchus figured it out. But it's gone, utterly and forever. If we multiply our sense of loss for this work of Aristarchus by 100,000, we begin to appreciate the grandeur of the achievement of classical civilization and the tragedy of its destruction. We have far surpassed the science known to the ancient world, but there are irreparable gaps in our historical knowledge. Imagine what mysteries of the past could be solved with a borrower's card to this library. For example, we know of a 3-volume history of the world, now lost, written by a Babylonian priest named Berosus. Volume 1 dealt with the interval from the creation of the world to the Great Flood, a period that he took to be 432,000 years, or about 100 times longer than the Old Testament chronology. What wonders were in the books of Berosus. But why books of Berosus? But why have I brought you across 2,000 years to the Library of Alexandria? Because this was when and where we humans first collected seriously and systematically the knowledge of the world. This is the Earth as Eratosthenes knew it, a tiny spherical world afloat in an immensity of space and time. We were at long last beginning to find our true bearings in the cosmos. The scientists of antiquity took the first and most important steps in that direction before their civilization fell apart. But after the Dark Ages, it was by and large the rediscovery of the works of these scholars, done here, that made the Renaissance possible and thereby powerfully influenced our own culture. When in the 15th century Europe was at last ready to awaken from its long sleep, it picked up some of the tools, the books, and the concepts laid down here more than 1,000 years before. By 1600, the long-forgotten ideas of Aristarchus had been rediscovered. Johannes Kepler constructed elaborate models to understand the motion and arrangement of the planets, the clockwork of the heavens. And at night, he dreamt of traveling to the moon. His principal scientific tools were the mathematics of the Alexandrian library and an unswerving respect for the facts, however disquieting they might be. His story and the story of the scientists who came after him are also part of our voyage. 70 years later, the sun-centered universe of Aristarchus and Copernicus was widely accepted in the Europe of the Enlightenment. The idea arose that the planets were worlds governed by laws of nature, and scientific speculation turned to the motions of the stars. The clockwork in the heavens was imitated by the watchmakers of Earth. Precise timekeeping permitted great sailing ship voyages of exploration and discovery, which bound up the Earth. This was a time when free inquiry was valued once again. 250 years later, the Earth was all explored. New adventurers now looked to the planets and the stars. The galaxies were recognized as great aggregates of stars, island universes, millions of light years away. In the 1920s, astronomers had begun to measure the speeds of distant galaxies.
What time is it? 7:15. All right, lights out, please.
They found that the galaxies were flying away from one another. To the astonishment of everyone, the entire universe was expanding. We had begun to plumb the true depths of time and space. The long collective enterprise of science has revealed a universe some 15 billion years old, the time since the explosive birth of the cosmos, the Big Bang. The cosmic calendar compresses the local history of the universe into a single year. If the universe began on January 1st, it was not until May that the Milky Way formed. Other planetary systems may have appeared in June, July, and August, but our Sun and Earth not until mid-September. Life arose soon after. Everything humans have ever done occurred in that bright speck at the lower right of the cosmic calendar. The Big Bang is at upper left, in the first second of January 1st. 15 billion years later is our present time, the last second of December 31st. Every month is 1¼ billion years long. Each day represents 40 million years. Each second stands for some 500 years of our history, the blinking of an eye in the drama of cosmic time. At this scale, the cosmic calendar is the size of a football field, but all of human history would occupy an area the size of my hand. We're just beginning to trace the long and tortuous path which began with the primeval fireball and led to the condensation of matter, gas, dust, stars, galaxies, and at least in our little nook of the universe, planets and life, intelligence, and inquisitive men and women. We've emerged so recently that the familiar events of our recorded history occupy only the last seconds of the last minute of December 31st. Some critical events for the human species, however, began much earlier, minutes earlier. So we change our scale from months to minutes. Down here, the first humans made their debut around 10:30 p.m. on December 31st. And with the passing of every cosmic minute, each minute 30,000 years long, we began the arduous journey towards understanding where we live and who we are. 11:46. Only 14 minutes ago, humans have tamed fire. 11:59:20, the evening of the last day of the cosmic year, the 11th hour, the 59th minute, the 20th second. The domestication of plants and animals begins. An application of the human talent for making tools. (11:59:35). Settled agricultural communities evolved into the first cities. We humans appear on the cosmic calendar so recently that our recorded history occupies only the last few seconds of the last minute of December 31st. In the vast ocean of time which this calendar represents, all our memories are confined to this small square. Every person we've ever heard of lived somewhere in there. All those kings and battles, migrations and inventions, wars and loves, everything in the history books happens here, in the last 10 seconds of the cosmic calendar. We on Earth have just awakened to the great oceans of space and time from which we have emerged. We are the legacy of 15 billion years of cosmic evolution. We have a choice. We can enhance life and come to know the universe that made us, or we can squander our 15 billion year heritage in meaningless self-destruction.
What happens in the first second of the next cosmic year depends on what we do here and now with our intelligence and our knowledge of the cosmos.
This process is called artificial selection. In the case of the Hakey crab, it was affected more or less unconsciously by the fishermen, and certainly without any serious contemplation by the crabs. Humans, for thousands of years, have deliberately selected which plants and animals shall live. We're surrounded with farm and domestic animals, fruits, vegetables. Where did they come from? Were they once free living in their present form in the wild and then induced to adopt some less strenuous life on the farm? No. They are, almost all of them, made by us.
The essence of artificial selection for a horse or a cow, a grain of rice or a Hakey crab is this. Many characteristics are inherited. They breed true.
Humans encourage the reproduction of some varieties and discourage the reproduction of others. The variety selected for eventually becomes abundant. The variety selected against becomes rare, may be extinct. But if artificial selection makes such changes in only a few thousand years, what must natural selection, working for billions of years, be capable of? The answer is all the beauty and diversity in the biological world. That life evolved over the ages is clear from the changes we've made in the beasts and vegetables, but also from the record in the rocks. The fossil evidence speaks to us unambiguously of creatures that were once present in enormous numbers and that have now vanished utterly. There are far more species that have become extinct than exist today. They're the terminated experiments in evolution.
These guys, for example, the trilobites, appeared 600 million years ago. They were around for 300 million years. They're all gone.
There's none left. But in those old rocks, there are no fossils of people or cattle. We've evolved only recently. Evolution is a fact, not a theory. It really happened. evolution as natural selection was the great discovery of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Here's how it works. Nature is prolific. There are many more creatures that are born than can possibly survive. So those varieties which are, by accident, less well adapted, don't survive. Or at least they leave fewer offspring. Now, mutations, sudden changes in heredity, are passed on. They breed true. The environment selects those occasional mutations which enhance survival. And the resulting series of slow changes in the nature of living beings is the origin of new species. Well, many people were scandalized by the ideas of evolution and natural selection. Our ancestors looked at the intricacy and beauty of life and saw evidence for a great designer. The simplest organism is a far more complex machine than the finest pocket watch. And yet, pocket watches don't spontaneously self-assemble or evolve in slow stages on their own from, say, grandfather clocks. A watch implies a watchmaker. So, there seemed to be no way in which atoms could spontaneously fall together and create, say, a then line. The idea of a designer is an appealing and altogether human explanation of the biological world. But as Darwin and Wallace showed, there's another way. Equally human and far more compelling.
Natural selection, which makes the music of life more beautiful as the eons pass. To understand the passage of the eons, we've compressed all of time into a single cosmic year with the Big Bang on January 1st. Every month here represents a little over 1 billion years. The Earth didn't form until the cosmic year was 2/3 over. Our understanding of the history of life is very recent, occupying only the last few seconds of December 31st, that small white spot at bottom right in the cosmic calendar. What happened on Earth may be more or less typical of the evolution of life on many worlds, but in its details, the story of life on Earth is probably unique in all the Milky Way galaxy. The secrets of evolution are time and death. Time for the slow accumulation of favorable mutations, and death to make room for new species. Life on Earth arose in September of the cosmic calendar, when our world, still heavily battered and cratered from its violent origin, may have looked a little like the moon.
The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. In the cosmic calendar, it condensed out of interstellar gas and dust around September 14th. We know from the fossil record that the origin of life happened soon afterwards, maybe around September 25th, something like that, probably in the ponds and oceans of the primitive Earth. Now, the first living things were not anything so complex as a one-celled organism, which already is a highly sophisticated form of life. No, the first stirrings of life were much more humble and happened on the molecular level. In those early days, lightning and ultraviolet light from the sun were breaking apart simple hydrogen-rich molecules in the primitive atmosphere, and the fragments of the molecules were spontaneously recombined into more and more complex molecules. The products of this early chemistry dissolved in the oceans, forming a kind of organic soup of gradually increasing complexity, until one day, quite by accident, a molecule arose which was able to make crude copies of itself, using as building blocks the other molecules in the soup. This was the ancestor of DNA, the master molecule of life on Earth. It's made of 4 different molecular parts called nucleotides, which constitute the 4 letters of the genetic code, the language of heredity. Each of the 4 nucleotides, the rungs on the DNA ladder,
are a different color in this model. The instructions that are spelled out are different for different organisms. That's why organisms are different. Now, a mutation is a change of a nucleotide, a misspelling of the genetic instructions. Most mutations spell genetic nonsense, as you'd expect, because they're random. They're harmful for the next generation. But a very few, by accident, make better sense than the original instructions and aid the evolution of life. DNA is about 1 billion times smaller than we see it here. In fact, each of these things that looks like a piece of fruit is an atom. Without the tools of science, the machinery of life would be invisible.
Four billion years ago, the ancestors of DNA were competing for molecular building blocks and leaving crude copies of themselves. There were no predators, the stuff of life was everywhere, so the oceans and the murky pools that filled the craters were for these molecules a Garden of Eden. With reproduction, mutation, and natural selection, the evolution of living molecules was well underway. Varieties with specialized functions then joined together, making a collective, the first cell. The organic soup eventually ate itself up. But by this time, plants had evolved, able to use sunlight to make their own building blocks. They turned the waters green. A number of one-cell plants joined together, the first multicellular organisms. Equally important was the invention, not made until early November, of sex. It was stumbled upon by the microbes. By December 1st, green plants had released copious amounts of oxygen and nitrogen. In mutation and natural selection, the evolution of living molecules was well underway. Varieties with specialized functions then joined together, making a collective, the first cell. The organic soup eventually ate itself up. But by this time, plants had evolved, able to use sunlight to make their own building blocks. They turned the waters green. A number of one-cell plants joined together, the first multicellular organisms. Equally important was the invention, not made until early November, of sex. It was stumbled upon by the microbes. By December 1st, green plants had released copious amounts of oxygen and nitrogen into the atmosphere. The sky is made by life. Then, suddenly, on December 15th, there was an enormous proliferation of new life forms, an event called the Cambrian explosion.
We know from the fossil record that life arose shortly after the formation of the Earth, suggesting that the origin of life might be an inevitable chemical process on countless Earth-like planets throughout the cosmos. But on the Earth, in nearly 4 billion years, life advanced no further than algae. So maybe more complex forms of life are harder to evolve, harder even than the origin of life itself. If this is right, the planets of the galaxy might be filled with microorganisms, but big beasts and vegetables and thinking beings might be comparatively rare.
By December 18th, there were vast herds of trilobites foraging on the ocean bottom, and squid-like creatures with their multicolored shells were everywhere. We know enough to sketch in a few of the subsequent details. The first fish and the first vertebrates appeared on December 19th. Plants began to colonize the land on December 20th. The first winged insects fluttered by on December 22nd. And on this date also, there were the first amphibians, creatures something like the lungfish, able to survive both on land and in water. Our direct ancestors were now leaving the oceans behind. The first trees and the first reptiles evolved on December 23rd. Two amazing evolutionary developments. we're descended from some of those reptiles. The dinosaurs appeared on Christmas Eve. There were many different kinds of dinosaurs. The Earth was once their planet. Many stood upright and had some fair intelligence. Great lizards crashed and thundered through the steaming jungles. Unnoticed by the dinosaurs, a new creature, whose young were born live and helpless, was making its timid debut. The first mammals emerged on December 26th, the first birds on the following day. But the dinosaurs still dominated the planet. Then, suddenly, without warning, all over the planet at once, the dinosaurs died. The cause is unknown, but the lesson is clear. Even 160 million years on a planet is no guarantee of survival. The dinosaurs perished around the time of the first flower.
On December 30th, the first creatures who looked even a little bit human evolved, accompanied by a spectacular increase in the size of their brains. And then, on the evening of the last day of the last month, only a few million years ago, the first true humans took their place on the cosmic calendar.
The written record of human history occupies only the last 10 seconds of the cosmic year. Now, let's take a closer look at who our ancestors were. A simple chemical circumstance led to one of the great moments in the history of our planet. There were many kinds of molecules in the primordial soup. Some were attracted to water on one side and repelled by it on the other. This drove them together into a tiny enclosed spherical shell, like a soap bubble, which protected the interior. Within the bubble, the ancestors of DNA found a home, and the first cell arose. It took hundreds of millions of years for tiny plants to evolve, giving off oxygen. But that branch didn't lead to us. Bacteria that could breathe oxygen took over 1 billion more years to evolve. From a naked nucleus, a cell developed with a nucleus inside. Some of these amoeba-like forms led eventually to plants. Others produced colonies, with inside and outside cells performing different functions, becoming a polyp attached to the ocean floor, filtering food from the water, and evolving little tentacles to direct food into a primitive mouth. This humble ancestor of ours also led to spiny-skinned, armored animals with internal organs, including our cousin, the starfish. But we don't come from starfish. About 550 million years ago, filter feeders evolved gill slits, which were more efficient at straining food particles from the water. One evolutionary branch led to acorn worms. Another led to a creature which swam freely in the larval stage, but as an adult was still firmly anchored to the ocean floor. Some became living hollow tubes, but others retained the larval forms throughout the life cycle and became free-swimming adults with something like a backbone. Our ancestors now, 500 million years ago, were jawless, filter-feeding fish, a little like lampreys. Gradually, those tiny fish evolved eyes and jaws. Fish then began to eat one another. If you could swim fast, you survived. If you had jaws to eat with, you could now use your gills to breathe the oxygen in the water. This is the way modern fish arose. During the summer, some swamps and lakes dried up, so some fish evolved a primitive lung to breathe air until the rains came. Their brains were getting bigger. If the rains didn't come, it was handy to be able to pull yourself along to the next swamp. That was a very important adaptation. first amphibians evolved, still with a fish-like tail. Amphibians, like fish, laid their eggs in water where they were easily eaten. But then a splendid new invention came along, the hard-shelled egg laid on the land where there were as yet no predators. Reptiles and turtles go back to those days. Many of the reptiles hatched on land never returned to the waters. Some became the dinosaurs. One line of dinosaurs developed feathers useful for short flights. Today, the only living descendants of the dinosaurs are the birds. The great dinosaurs evolved along another branch. Some were the largest flesh eaters ever to walk the land, but 65 million years ago, they all mysteriously perished. Meanwhile, the forerunners of the dinosaurs were also evolving in a different direction. Small, scurrying creatures, with the young growing inside the mother's body. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, many different forms developed. The young were very immature at birth, in the marsupials, the wombat for example, and in the mammals. The young had to be taught how to survive. The brain grew larger still. Something like a shrew was the ancestor of all the mammals. One line took to the trees, developing dexterity, stereovision, larger brains, and a curiosity about their environment. Some became baboons, but that's not the line to us. Apes and humans have a recent common ancestor. Bone for bone, muscle for muscle, molecule for molecule. There are almost no important differences between apes and humans. Unlike the chimpanzee, our ancestors walked upright, freeing their hands to poke and fix and experiment. We got smarter. We began to talk. Many collateral branches of the human family became extinct in the last few million years. We, with our brains and our hands, are the survivors. There's an unbroken thread that stretches from those first cells to us. Let's look at it again, compressing 4 billion years of evolution into 40 seconds. Those are some of the things that molecules do, given 4 billion years of evolution. We sometimes represent evolution as the ever-branching ramifications of some original trunk, each branch pruned and clipped by natural selection. Every plant and animal alive today has a history as ancient and illustrious as ours. Humans stand on one branch, but now we affect the future of every branch of this 4 billion year old tree. How lovely trees are. The human species grew up in and around them. We have a natural affinity for trees. Trees photosynthesize, they harvest sunlight, they compete for the sun's favors. Look at those two trees over there, pushing and shoving for sunlight, but with grace and astonishing slowness. There are so many plants on the earth that there's a danger of thinking them trivial, of losing sight of the subtlety and efficiency of their design. They are great and beautiful machines, powered by sunlight, taking in water from the ground and carbon dioxide from the air and converting them into food for their use and ours. This is a museum of living plants, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London. Every plant uses the carbohydrates it makes as an energy source to go about its planty business. And we animals, who are ultimately parasites on the plants, we steal the carbohydrates so we can go about our business. In eating the plants and their fruits, we combine the carbohydrates with oxygen, which, as a result of breathing, we've dissolved in our blood. From this chemical reaction, we extract the energy which makes us go. In the process, we exhale carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which the plants then use to make more carbohydrates. What a marvelous cooperative arrangement. Plants and animals each using the other's waste gases. The whole cycle powered by abundant sunlight. But there would be carbon dioxide in the air, even if there were no animals. We need the plants much more than they need us.
There are many family resemblances among the organisms of the Earth. Some are very apparent, such as the use of the number 5. Humans have 5 major bodily projections: 1 head, 2 arms, 2 legs. So do ducks, although the functions of their bodily projections are not quite the same. An octopus or a centipede has a different plan, and a being from another planet might be much stranger still. These family resemblances continue, and on a much deeper level, when we go to the molecular basis of life. There are tens of billions of different kinds of organic molecules, yet only about 50 of them are used in the essential machinery of life. The same 50 employed over and over again, ingeniously, for different functions, in every living thing. And when we go to the very kernel of life on Earth, to the proteins that control cell chemistry, to the spiral or helix of the nucleic acids which carry the hereditary information, we find these molecules to be absolutely identical in all plants and animals of our planet.
This oak tree and me, we're made of the same stuff. If you go back far enough, you'll find that we have a common ancestor. That's why our chemistry is so alike. Let's take a trip to examine this common basis of life, a voyage to investigate the molecular machinery at the heart of life on Earth, a journey to the nucleus of the cell. First, we need a cell. I have trillions. I can afford to donate a few.
The casual act of pricking a finger is an event of some magnitude on the scale of the very small. Millions of red blood cells are detoured from their usual routes. But most continue to cruise about the body, carrying their cargoes of oxygen to the remotest freckle. We're about to enter the living cell, a realm in its own way as complex and beautiful as the realm of galaxies and stars. Among the many red blood cells, we encounter a white blood cell, a lymphocyte, whose job it is to protect me against invading microbes. It makes antibodies on its furrowed surface, but its interior is like that of many cells.
plunging through the membrane, we find ourselves inside the cell. Here, every structure has its function. Those dark green blobs are factories, where messenger molecules are busy building the enzymes which control the chemistry of the cell. The messengers were instructed and dispatched from within the nucleus, the heart and brain of the cell. All the instructions on how to get a cell to work and how to make another are hidden away in there. We find a tunnel, a nuclear pore, an approach to the biological holy of holies. These necklaces, these intricately looped and coiled strands, are nucleic acids, DNA. Everything you need to know on how to make a human being is encoded in the language of life, in the DNA molecule. This is the DNA double helix, a machine with about 100 billion moving parts called atoms. There are as many atoms in one molecule of DNA as there are stars in a typical galaxy. The sequence of nucleotides, here brightly colored, is all that's passed on from generation to generation. Change the order of the nucleotides, and you change the genetic instructions. DNA must replicate itself with extreme fidelity. The reproduction of a DNA molecule begins by separating the two helices. This is accomplished by an unwinding enzyme. Like some precision tool, this enzyme, shown in blue, breaks the chemical bonds that connect the nucleotides and bind the two helices of DNA together. The enzyme works its way down the molecule, unzipping DNA as it goes. Each helix copies the other, supervised by special enzymes. The organic soup inside the nucleus contains many free nucleotides. The enzyme recognizes an approaching nucleotide and clips it into place, reproducing another rung in the double helix. When the DNA is replicating in one of your cells, a few dozen nucleotides are added every second. Thousands of these enzymes may be working on a given DNA molecule. When an arriving nucleotide doesn't fit, the enzyme throws it away. We call this proofreading. On the rare occasions of a proofreading error, the wrong nucleotide is attached, and a small random change has been made in the genetic instructions. A mutation has occurred. This enzyme is a pretty small molecule, but it catches nucleotides, it assembles them in the right order, it knows how to proofread. It's responsible in the most fundamental way for the reproduction of every cell and every being on Earth. That enzyme and DNA itself are molecular machines with awesome powers. Within every living thing, the molecular machines are busy making sure that nucleic acids will continue to reproduce. A minor cut in my skin sounds a local alarm, and the blood spins a complex net of strong fibers, form a clot, and staunch the flow of blood. There's a very delicate balance here. Too much clotting, and your bloodstream will solidify. Too little clotting, and you'll bleed to death from the merest scratch. The balance is controlled by enzymes, instructed by DNA. Down here, there's also a kind of sanitation squad comprised of white blood cells that swings into action, surrounds invading bacteria, and ravenously consumes them.
This mopping up operation is another part of the healing process, again, controlled by DNA. These cells are parts of us, but how alien they seem. Within each of them, within every cell, there are exquisitely evolved molecular machines, nucleic acids, enzymes, the cell architecture. Every cell is a triumph of natural selection. And we're made of trillions of cells. We are, each of us, a multitude. Within us is a little universe.
Human DNA is a coiled ladder, a billion nucleotides long. Many possible combinations of nucleotides are nonsense. That is, they translate into proteins which serve no useful function whatever. Only a comparatively few nucleic acid molecules are any good for life forms as complicated as we are. But even so, the number of useful ways of assembling nucleic acids is stupefyingly large. It's probably larger than the total number of atoms in the universe. This means that the number of possible kinds of human beings is vastly greater than the number of human beings that has ever lived. This untapped potential of the human species is immense. There must be ways of putting nucleic acids together which will function far better by any criterion you wish to choose than the hereditary instructions of any human being who has ever lived. Fortunately, we do not know, or at least do not yet know, how to assemble alternative sequences of nucleotides to make alternative kinds of human beings. But in the future, we might well be able to put nucleotides together in any desired sequence to produce whatever human characteristics we think desire. A disquieting and awesome prospect. We human beings don't look very much like a tree. We certainly view the world differently than a tree does. But down deep, at the molecular heart of life, we're essentially identical to trees. We both use nucleic acids as the hereditary material. We both use proteins as enzymes to control the chemistry of the cell. And most significantly, we both use the identical code book to translate nucleic acid information into protein information. Any tree could read my genetic code. How did such astonishing similarities come about? Why are we cousins to the trees? Would life on some other planet use proteins, the same nucleic acids, the same genetic code? The usual explanation is that we are, all of us, trees and people, anglerfish, slime molds, bacteria, all descended from a single and common instance of the origin of life 4 billion years ago in the early days of our planet. Now, how did the molecules of life arise?
University, we mix together the gases and waters of the primitive Earth, supply some energy, and see if we can make the stuff of life. But what was the early atmosphere made of? Ordinary air? If we start with our present atmosphere, the experiment is a dismal failure.
instead of making proteins and nucleic acids, all we make is smog, a backward step. Why doesn't such an experiment work? Because the air of today contains molecular oxygen. But oxygen is made by plants. It's pretty obvious that there were no plants before the origin of life. We mustn't use oxygen in our experiments because there wasn't any oxygen in the early atmosphere. This is perfectly reasonable because the cosmos is made mostly of hydrogen, which gobbles oxygen up. The Earth's low gravity has allowed most of our original hydrogen gas to trickle away to space. There's almost none left. But 4 billion years ago, our atmosphere was full of hydrogen-rich gases: methane, ammonia, water vapor. These are the gases we should use. Taking great care to ensure the purity of these gases, my colleague Vikshåland pumps them from their holding flasks. An experiment like this was first performed by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey in the 1950s. The starting gases are now introduced into a large reaction vessel. We could shine ultraviolet light on this mixture, simulating the early sun. But in this experiment, the gases will be sparked, as the primitive atmosphere was by early lightning. After only a few hours, the interior of the reaction vessel becomes streaked with a strange brown pigment, a rich collection of complex organic molecules, including the building blocks of the proteins and the nucleic acids. Under the right conditions, these building blocks assemble themselves into molecules resembling little proteins and little nucleic acids. These nucleic acids can even make identical copies of themselves. In this vessel are the notes of the music of life, although not yet the music itself. Now, no one so far has mixed together the gases and waters of the primitive Earth and at the end of the experiment had something crawl out of the flask. There's still a great deal to be understood about the origin of life, including the origin of the genetic code. But we've only been at such experiments for 30 years. Nature has had a 4 billion year head start. Incidentally, there's nothing in such experiments that's unique to the Earth. The gases we start with, the energy sources we use, are entirely common through the cosmos. So chemical reactions, something like these, must be responsible for the organic matter in interstellar space and the amino acids in the meteorites. Similar chemical reactions must have occurred on 1 billion other worlds in the Milky Way galaxy. Look how easy it is to make great globs of this stuff. The molecules of life fill the cosmos. Now, what would life elsewhere look like? Even if it had an identical molecular chemistry to life on Earth, which I very much doubt, it could not be similar, very similar, in form to familiar organisms on the Earth. The random character of the evolutionary process must create elsewhere creatures very different from any that we know. Think of a world something like Jupiter, with an atmosphere rich in hydrogen, helium, methane, water, and ammonia, in which organic molecules might be falling from the skies like manna from heaven, like the products of the Miller-Urey experiment. Could there be life on such a world? Well, there's a special problem.
The atmosphere is turbulent, and down deep, before we ever come to a surface, it's very hot. If you're not careful, you'll be carried down and fried. So one way to make a living is to reproduce before you're fried. Turbulence will carry some of your offspring to the higher and cooler layers. Such organisms could be very little. We call them sinkers. The physicist E.E. Salpeter and I at Cornell have calculated something about the other kinds of life that might exist on such a world. Vast living balloons could stay buoyant by pumping heavy gases from their interiors or by keeping their insides warm. They might eat the organic molecules in the air or make their own with sunlight. We call these creatures floaters. We imagine floaters kilometers across, enormously larger than the greatest whale that ever was, beings the size of cities. We conceive of them arrayed in great lazy herds as far as the eye can see, concentrated in the updrafts in an enormous sea of clouds. But there could be other creatures in this alien environment, hunters. Hunters are fast and maneuverable. They eat the floaters, both for their organic molecules and for their store of pure hydrogen. But there can't be many hunters, because if they destroy all the floaters, they themselves will perish. Physics and chemistry permit such life forms. Art presents them with a certain reality, but nature is not obliged to follow our speculations. However, if there are billions of inhabited worlds in the Milky Way galaxy, then I think it's likely that there are a few places which might have hunters and floaters and sinkers. Biology is more like history than it is like physics. You have to know the past to understand the present. There's no predictive theory of biology, just as there's no predictive theory of history. The reason is the same. Both subjects are still too complicated for us. But we can understand ourselves much better by understanding other cases. The study of a single instance of extraterrestrial life, no matter how humble, a microbe would be just fine, will de-provincialize biology. It will show us what else is possible. We've heard so far the voice of life on only a single world. But for the first time, as we shall see, we've begun a serious scientific search for the cosmic fugue. In recent years, we've learned much more about the origin of life. Do you remember RNA, that nucleic acid that our cells use as messengers carrying the genetic information out of the cell nucleus? Well, it's been found that RNA, like protein, can control chemical reactions, as well as reproduce itself, which proteins can't do. Many scientists are now wondering if the first life on Earth was an RNA molecule. And it now seems feasible that key molecular building blocks for the origin of life fell out of the skies 4 billion years ago. Comets have now been found to have a lot of organic molecules in them, and they fell in huge numbers on the primitive Earth. We also mentioned the extinction of the dinosaurs, and most of the other species of life on Earth about 65 million years ago. We now know that a large comet hit the Earth at just that time. The dust pall from that collision must have cooled and darkened the Earth, perhaps killing all the dinosaurs, but sparing the small, furry mammals who were our ancestors. Other cometary mass extinctions in other epochs seem likely. If true, this would mean that comets have been the bringers both of life and death.